We have finally arrived at season 3 of the Most Podern Podcast on the topic of design research. If you're like us and want to learn more about how buildings get built, then we made this podcast for you. The season was a lot of fun to make. Listen on for a little preview of what you can look forward to. Why research? Why do we spend the past month interviewing different people on their research projects?
Well, I think from our original conversations last season, which was more about careers, we started to realize that, there's one way of dealing with the built environment, which is directly through your actual occupation, basically saying, I do this and I build this. But there's a whole industry that we soon discovered around creating knowledge around the implementation of things as well. And that there's a lot of people who have a stake in the built environment. And so trying to figure out and uncover a little bit about how that knowledge gets created, disseminated, how it then gets applied to actual projects, which is something we intuitively know happens, but we weren't quite sure exactly how. And I think our conversations this season really illustrated a little bit about how that can unfold.
And not just in academia, but also professionally in a professional setting. Like we interviewed Brian Lee, who is researching material at Autodesk, and they are actually implementing it in a real project. So we got to get a sense of how things work in the professional setting as well.
I think one of the interesting things is that in school you learn so much and kind of the stimulation is so high. And when you go into practice, sometimes that stimulation kind of stops and you feel like you're just working and going through the motions of practice. But that's not the end all be all of I guess what the world looks like after school, right? Like there is all of these different pursuits out there that is dedicated to increasing of the boundaries of knowledge within the built environment.
Yeah. Part of it is just simply because we want to iterate. So I would say that any sort of iteration is a form of research because you learn by trial and error. One of the issues with the built environment is that we can't iterate that quickly, just given the scale and complexity of the projects. Right. And so you do need people who actually go in and focus specifically on certain components within, say, a building or within a city that can then be studied over a length of time, but then different projects can kind of come in and plug into that acquired knowledge. So I do think that this is something that's really fascinating because, for one, we actually interviewed a ton of architects. All of our guests, just by happenstance, happened to start off as architects and then probably reach some sort of level of speciality or some level of expertise in something that then they can go in and apply a certain high-level research mind towards a pursuit, which downstream will have an effect on the actual built environment.
I think we wanted to uncover whether there is a path as a researcher after graduation, because oftentimes some of my students as well, and I also heard it from you, Alex, that there are students out there who are only interested in producing research, whatever specialty that may be, but questions, where to start. And I think our guests this season actually showed multiple options already.
Yeah, the other thing, one of the motivations, the agendas of this podcast is to really bring people to the forefront who are doing this background work. And you might be a practitioner, you might be a student out there listening to us. And our hope is that when you hear some of our guests this time around, you say, well, they might be focusing on this aspect of the product or the built environment, and somehow that relates to what I'm doing. And you can either reach out to them, you can connect with them, or you can just become more informed about how they're doing their work. What's interesting about research is it's not specific towards a certain product or certain type of development. It's really a lot of times more broad, more category based. So whether it's about materiality, whether it's about zoning policy, whether it's about machine learning, there are a whole bunch of applications for some of this research that can then be spread and brought into any specific project. And I think that's one of our intentions, right?
Yeah, so diverse, so interconnected, this world of the built space.
Some of our guests are from academia. They do research within the academic environment, but a good portion of our guests do research within the industry environment. Like their research has a goal and has actually to be applied onto real projects, or are working within partnership with other companies. The built environment has so many interconnected pieces that it's not something that you necessarily have to do within the academic environment. There is the potential to create these interesting opportunities out there in industry.
Yeah,
and also let's be honest, research is a great marketing tool. If you found a shiny new material, a shiny new technology that can help your day-to-day workings and make things more efficient, then that has not actual, but that has monetary value.
Well, it's all about value at the end of the day. If you're not producing knowledge of value, then it's not valuable. And so part of it can be, yes, monetary value. So we interviewed Brian Lee. He works at Autodesk. I think their market cap, their company value is upwards of 47 billion right now. So it's a lot of value there. And obviously a lot of that is tied up in their services and their products, but they are expanding into research. But then we also talked to Irmak Turan from Thornton Tomasetti, and her value is quite straightforward and it's very obvious to a lot of us. It's how do we make buildings more sustainable? How do we make them more efficient? How do we make them, I think in her words, pretty much have a smaller effect on the natural environment around us? And I don't think you need to be a financier to figure out that that is important and valuable too. So we reached out to people in particular that we feel are driving this kind of quest for knowledge, along with a sense of that making sure that that knowledge has some practical application, that it contributes to a larger discussion. And sometimes it's this work is sequestered behind lab doors, or it's kind of kept within companies or relegated to a specific client. But I think the conversations that you'll hear this over the next few weeks really try to expand towards a much broader audience. I think a lot of people that I know want to get into research because they enjoyed the studio environment within school. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure a lot of our guests felt that way too, but this is not necessarily that. There are still requirements. It's not total freedom.
Right. It was really fascinating when we talked to Yasushi Sakai from MIT Media Lab in hearing how actually the Media Lab works, because although I'm a graduate of MIT, Media Lab was such an entity by its own, like operated within, although they were included as part of the architecture school, like their whole operation is based on labs. Mm-hmm. Like also, like maybe for the students, they'll be curious, what is a lab? Because you don't get to it's also, the labs are kind of secretive and they seem like a very closed group of people. Like you need to be very special to be included, but it's really just a group of people who are like-minded and who likes to work and also try to do something outside of their curricular activities, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's a good time actually for us to run through who we have on the season and who listeners can expect to hear from later on. So, for instance, Minkoo, you touched on Yasushi. Do you want to maybe intro him and a little bit of what he's doing?
Yeah, Yasushi Sakai is a PhD candidate at MIT Media Lab. He is conducting his research on a understanding of the voting system, understanding of an evaluation, in a purpose and a goal to provide a better solution for complicated issues such as the zoning process, the community meetings at the zoning process, where there are a lot of representatives from different parts of representing different parts of the city and also the community, and they're all raising their voices on a specific project. But we all know that the process can be very muddy, and that only considering the voices at those meetings cannot represent the entire community's voice. So his research, I think, if completed and actually utilized, it can make that process much more transparent and also relatable for people who are not even present at those meetings.
Yeah, we also
I guess you're also the right person to introduce yourself as a guest this season, along with Helena and Tony. Can you tell us a little bit about what you guys were up to?
Yeah, that's true. I was honored to be part of the season as a guest.
We're honored to have you.
So I am completing a book right now with Helena, Rong, and Tony Yang. The title is The Value of Design. It's a research that actually came out of the MIT Real Estate Innovation Lab, who was led by Dr. Andrea Chagou, who sadly passed. We tried to respond to this misinterpretation or misunderstanding of what design brings to the table in commercial real estate. Design is heavily unrecognized, and the value that brings, although the designers influence the building a lot, How it is interpreted in terms of data are very limited into the size of building, when it was built, number of stories. And the details and the nuances that the architects bring in terms of massing, in terms of material, in terms of its programmatic uses, public space, so on and so forth, those are not captured during that valuation process of commercial real estate. So we tried to question, so our book started from that question, and we've tried to propose and present a numerical study on whether there is a design value in commercial real estate. And guess what? There actually is.
Well, we'll have to stay tuned and find out exactly what that value is. I'm sure a lot of people would be interested. We had a few guests too who were working for larger corporations. And I think it may be interesting to maybe profile them and compare them against each other.
Yeah, so we had Ermak, who works for Thornton Tomasetti. That's a huge engineering consulting firm. She is the head of sustainability. She had a very interesting perspective on not only what her role was within the company, but also what the company's role was in context with all the projects that they get to help and consult and assist on. And I think sustainability is going to be a big topic. I think not only this season, but probably incoming seasons. And she was a really good person to give us the baseline on what we're looking at in terms of building sustainability from here on for the next probably decade or two.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those buzzwords that you hear all the time. But I think when you actually take a step back and say, well, what does that actually mean? It's probably hard to create a sort of well-rounded definition. So I think she did actually a really excellent job explaining that in terms, especially as it relates to buildings and spaces.
And we also had Yair Titaboim, who is currently spearheading the transformative venture-driven initiative at Hines. Hines is a global real estate development company having headquartered in Houston, Texas. And Yair, he is the one who's leading their venture initiatives, and who has also a background in architectural design, changed his trajectory by picking up coding, and also other real estate finance tools at MIT.
The idea is that this is a huge developer that has lots of assets in its portfolio. They operate these buildings, they rent them out, and yet they're also highly aware of how important knowledge, especially with relation to the market and future kind of developments, is in terms of their growth and their potential as a business.
We talked a lot about how real estate, construction, architecture is a very archaic industry that doesn't look forward. But here you have someone who's right in this middle of this transition, right, of this historic generational real estate company that's looking into venture capital, into all of these investments, investing in things like blockchain, AI, all these things that Yair is right in the middle of, helping them put their money towards the future into something that probably not a lot of companies are really willing to take that risk in.
No, for sure. And it's interesting because, yeah, like you said, Libo, we often joke that real estate is such an uninnovative field. And yet, if you actually look underneath the hood, if I were to take Hines as an example, they are doing a lot that is actually very forward-looking in both the physical and the digital worlds.
Yeah. So as a data scientist and architect at heart, we'll hear more from Yair on how he made the transition and what type of impact he's making at Hines.
And then there's another. We also talked to Brian Lee from Autodesk. Libo, maybe you can tell us about what his contribution was.
Yeah, so I think Brian comes from an interesting background. Went to architecture school both for undergrad and grad school, but as he emerged into the professional world, really saw this opportunity to do something different. So his background is really in digital research, generative design, but also fabrication, which I think is a really interesting connection between what we now produce as design outcomes and into what allows those things to become real buildings, right? We now draw everything in CAD, everything in Revit, but those digital files then gets directly translated into manufacturing files. So kind of shortcutting a lot of those connections. But what is really interesting about his work at Autodesk is an exploration of materials, which is something that we don't necessarily immediately imagine as design research, but in the way that I think he talks about it, is that we're faced with these problems that we can only explore solutions within these boundaries and confines of what we know. But truly to achieve the goals that we have, to meet these sustainability goals, to meet these passive house goals, right, we have to explore things that take us out of those boundaries really towards where we need to go. And what is limiting us is materials. So the undertaking of someone like Autodesk, who really has that horizontal penetration across the whole industry, is that they can enable people to build better through this research.
Yeah, it was extremely fascinating too. And what's kind of surprising, Autodesk is known for making AutoCAD. They have Revit. They're a software company, essentially. But what's quite fascinating in our conversation, we said, well, it sort of makes sense, actually, that they're dealing with this because they're not only developing the actual material, but they're also developing the means and methods for that material to then be applied. And I think it sort of underscores the importance of applied research. So maybe that's actually a more specific kind of definition of what we are looking for with this season, is not only how do you come up with a thing, but what's essential in the built environment is how do you actually implement it and put it into the world. Brian definitely reveals a little bit of how that works, some of the complexities in that process, because of course, the more people you bring in, the more difficult it becomes. But also just how even just small scale interventions, when applied at a larger scale or en masse, can have widespread effects or intentions.
Yeah, I
Alex,
can't wait to see.
Good opportunity to intro Peter, who has a foot in both worlds, both researching and building.
But Peter is an interesting candidate. Actually, when you probably think about research, you might think about universities, and he's Yasushi is working in Media Lab, but Peter's the only professor, so he's the only one who's researching while he's teaching that we've included this time around. And Peter Deyi is a graduate of Rice University, Libo and my alma mater. He has taught previously at the University of Michigan as a fellow, and now he's an assistant professor at the University of Cincinnati. And what I find particularly interesting about his research, and what we talked a lot about in the show, was how you can take issues of zoning, policy, basically thinking about architecture a little bit wider, more about the context, and then seeing how that's being implemented and dealt with in the world. So Peter's research deals a lot with new zoning policy in California in particular, or in places that are experiencing major building constraints and difficulties. So trying to take on the housing crisis, for instance. How do we increase density? How do we make things more affordable? And Peter takes a very architectural, very design approach to these things. So he'll take an existing policy or a proposed policy, and he'll basically run it through a series of tests in the form of a project and say, okay, if we take this policy, we can then do this, this, and this. So I think it's it's one of the more creative types of research that we've seen. It's more in line with traditional architecture, but the goal is not necessarily to create a building. It's more to create a discussion or a set of ideas around a policy or around something that's happening in the outside world. It's not very disciplinary in the sense that it's not only relegated to architecture, but it's actually quite wide open. I think what's really fascinating about his work is that anybody can engage with it. You don't necessarily have to be an architect. So I'm curious what you guys thought about the conversation too.
I think the notion of idea is really interesting, because one of the things about designing buildings in general is that you really only get to realize one idea. But we look at policy, we look at all these things, but how those things actually result in a built project or a change in the environment, it's really unknown. Mm-hmm. And someone like Peter actually putting visuals to that idea, giving you a sense of, if this policy is implemented in this way, it might have a different imagined outcome. I think that's has a really strong impact, because once you capture the imagination of people, then you can much better motivate them to move towards a positive end.
Yeah, the other one part I appreciate about Peter was that his research on a specific idea is also rooted in realistic constraints in terms of policy, zoning, and although not all of the constraints are included, like a bit of financing too, although not all are resolved, but I do think it is a meaningful step to creating much more impactful design research, where it is taking an actual case, an actual problem, rather than inventing a problem that may or may not exist for a very specific people. And it's not a search in terms of creative form or search for freedom in form or anything related to form, but it's more rooted towards responding to an actual problem, issue, and trying to utilize design and creative thinking to come up with some sort of mediation or some sort of, attractive path forward that everyone can join in and actually execute.
Yeah, from my perspective, he does deal a lot with form, and I think it's important, but he always connects form to something else. Form is a vehicle for you to address another concern, whether it be density, whether it be zoning, whether it be finance in some circumstances. And so by that regard, I think the work is actually very clever, but also very consequential. And therefore, I think deserves a lot of attention because although something might not happen exactly, if someone were to design the same building and be given the contract, they might not design it exactly the same way. But what Libo you're saying, and also what you're saying, Minkoo, is really true. Once you assign a certain vision towards this set of ideas, then it becomes much more widespread and open. It can start to influence things at a much broader level, which I think is the goal of research in the end, is to sort of change the way the world views things and to give it more information.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it doesn't need to be, and I don't think it can be all resolved and a perfect product in the research phase. The research phase is to point at things and start the conversation. If you have enough people who are engaged and convinced by their research, then you have you can create the momentum. So research is a great way to start such a movement, to bring reality to an idea. And also, it is a great way to establish yourself as an expert in a certain field.
I think what's interesting is that we set out on this season and all of us were like, what is design research? And we didn't really have a good answer. But I think after talking to all these folks who do research in all of these different domains, one thing that has really emerged for me is that design research is about the exploration of these new ideas that you can bring back to the table that can really open the minds and the solution spaces that other people inhabit in their pursuit to find a design solution. So I'm curious for both of you, like, what changed for you about your definition of design research through our exploration of the season?
I think one thing that has stayed the same, at least I'll start with to answer your question, Libo, but one thing that has been a constant is this idea of iteration, and that research in itself is the act of finding things through trial and error, through trying new things and seeing what the outcomes are. And I think that's something that still exists in whatever field, scale, domain, materiality you're dealing with. And like go back to what I said at the beginning, a lot of times we've made mistakes at very large scale within the built environment. And so it is really critical that we have the time and space, energy, focus, and resources to go towards making sure that the margin for error, I guess, is reduced to as small as possible. When it comes to what design research is, I would say that it's anything that contributes to a better understanding about how things function within a context. So that might be a specific place, that might be a general political context, it might be a certain kind of societal context. And I think what is interesting about this is a lot of the work we're doing is very kind of relevant right now, anticipating that it's going to change in the future. So one thing too that separates research from design is design can be kind of complete, but research just leads to the next question. And I would say that any of the guests that we brought on would say, yes, this is what we're focusing on now, but I can't necessarily tell you exactly if that's going to be the case in 5, 10, or 20 years. In fact, most likely it's going to be different. So I think that there is this kind of pursuit of the unknown, which is just sort of the human nature. Why, what are we, where are we, why are we doing this? But to get a little bit more specific, it's about how we should do things moving forward, not necessarily what we should be doing, because I think some of those terms are a little bit more defined now than they were in previous generations, especially when it regards to the climate, when it regards to society and density, and with regards to just how we should be as a group of people, as a collective.
Yeah, for me, it was very useful and eye-opening to see many examples of how academia and practice can work together. Meaning, I actually started as a researcher in my career. I started as a researcher at Straka Institute. And then that's where I actually learned the ways of how to conduct the research, mainly getting tutored from architects. And that I thought was the only way to do research. But of course, after that, sorry, I'll do this again. But of course, after that, I had many experiences that expanded my perspective on research. But this set of interviews were actually confirming that academia and the industry, the relationship there is bounded through, means and manus, right? Like you do the research and then you try to implement it in real life. It's not going to be perfect. And then you learn what you learned, what worked, what did not. And then you go back to the research lab, you do more exploration and come back again. So I think the people that we invited are actually living proofs of that cycle and circle of knowledge being generated. So I appreciated talking to these people.
I feel like I learned a lot through these conversations, and there was a lot of surprises for me that I wasn't expecting from research. The classical view that I have on research is, you conduct an experiment, you have a control, you have a test, and you have to have a conclusion about something that derives from something that you've proved through your research. But from our conversations, it seems like there's so much value in something that's not just that. And I think Peter's conversation really hit home for me in that, where the presentation of an idea, the arrival at a possibility of what can be created through these constraints, is in itself not only a method of research, but also a conclusion that has broad impact, whether or not it happened in a lab or is a provable experiment in one place or another.
Do you think that it's also limited by your ability to communicate that to other people? I think one, maybe especially within academia, there's a sort of idea that if I do the work, people will care about it. And yet for our guests, I think that they are trying to promote it and make sure that, maybe that's why they came on the podcast, but make sure that people understand what they're doing and understand the value of that so that it can then be applied in different corners of the world.
I think that communication piece is important regardless of whether you're doing design research or any other type of research, right? I think if you look at one of the metrics of how successful a paper is how much it's cited in other papers. And your paper is not going to get cited unless it communicates an idea well enough for other people to use it as a foundation for their idea and their communication. And I think maybe it just has an extra emphasis when it comes to design research, where this visual communication, this communication about physical possibilities is so important, because it's quite hard for someone to take a very abstract idea like a policy and connect it to something that's built and something that could exist in the real world.
Yeah, I think that's actually the key essence of this, is taking something and demonstrating what it could be, which is a little bit different from just design itself, because you can say, okay, this could be what the house looks like. But there's a sort of more broad, larger scale, top-down view that a lot of our guests are trying to, that's part of their agenda, is basically showing people, okay, this is how things should be. Because it's, again, we always talk about, it's a complicated subject, the built environment. Things are convoluted and they take a lot of time and energy to get implemented. So you do need people and actors out there who can kind of lead the way and say, this is a good idea, or this might work, this might be beneficial.
There was like one snippet, I think, of our conversation with Brian that really highlights this. I think you asked a question about the MoMA PS1 exhibition with the mushroom bricks. It's an exhibition, right? It sort of hints at a possibility, but it's not something that someone's going to see and say, hey, like, now let's go build my multifamily condo in mushroom bricks, right? But Brian was actually originally involved in that project, and now he's actually, again, doing mushroom materials, but he has to pass them through all these rigorous kind of like building tests, material tests, in order to make it a material that's real enough to be implemented in a prototype project, in order to show everyone else that, hey, this is a foundational possibility that you can use this new material in a building to this effect, so that it's something that then makes it out into a world on more than just a news article or a single building, and something that we can see more and more of.
I think for this sort of research, when you're dealing with the built environment, it's not just innovation. It's not just showing people what it is. it's all about credibility in the sense that you need to prove the concept, not that it can exist, but that it can be used, that it's marketable, that it's financially viable, that it's sustainable, that it can be maintained. All of these things that go through actually take a lot of time, not just to do the work, but also to demonstrate that over a certain amount of time, things will stand up. And I think a lot of what our guests were doing is actually looking at something in the present, but thinking of it over multiple time scales.
Yeah, the Phoenix. I can't wait to see how it progresses.
Well, indeed. I mean, and if you think about multifamily housing, one thing that I think that's really interesting about that project, so when you listen to Brian's interviews, he actually created a facade system for affordable housing project in Oakland. It also totally changes the way that people perceive affordable housing by changing actually the components characteristics at a qualitative level. You actually change the aesthetics too. And then when you deploy it en masse in a number of buildings, you also change what people perceive or can think of when it comes to affordable housing, which I think is a different agenda, maybe probably not their primary one, but actually leads to other questions and could change the environment in many different ways.
I think the timescale perspective is a really important one, especially when it comes to research within the built environment, because it just does take so long, not only for things to get built, but also for things to become real enough for other people to start taking the risk of using them. And I think, Minkoo, throughout many conversations, you always bring up this point of like, why is this worth it for me to take the risk, right? And I think that's really important. Like, all of our guests had to not only put this idea out there, but make it real enough so that people are willing to take the financial risk to implement this idea into their built projects.
Yeah, it's essential. It really is. We can, again, I always go back to the question of the day is not what we should do, it's really how we should do it. And if we can't demonstrate how it's possible, then my personal feeling, this is just my opinion, is it's almost not worth it. But part of research is also finding whether something is possible or not. And so even, I'm sure our guests probably had a lot of failed experiments too. And even though those don't show up in the press release or they don't talk about it on our show, they do inform how we get there. And so one thing that I've always thought about research is it's quite additive. You continue down a line, and the more you work, the more you learn. And even a failure is a data point that can then lead to new discovery.
I think the point about failure, again, I think is super important, is that in the building industry, it's very hard to make room for failure. If you're a developer just starting up, you only have so many failures built in you, right? Or you're going to go out of business. But it's almost the burden on researchers to continuously fail and push us into the territory where failure is that place we can learn from in order to bring something new and crystallize a new idea into our built context.
Yeah, that's why Autodesk is a perfect candidate or perfect example of how private sectors can push the boundaries in the built environment. I'm not saying it because their project is going to be a failure. Of course not. But you need to have a certain bandwidth that will allow you to fail. Mm-hmm. And I think better research and good research, something that's radical, something that's new, something that's impactful, can be created when you're allowed to fail.
Yeah, I think applied research, one thing, I think sort of organically, we've dealt with a lot of people who are either practicing and researching at the same time, or they're working hand in hand with people who are implementing the work in the real world. And I think that's really quite critical. And if there's anybody out there who's interested in a career in research, I think you have to kind of define that expertise so that it can then be applied and provide value in the larger world. Curiosity is really important. Interesting things are important. But I think at this moment in time, our margin for error is actually quite small. And so the world is looking for these solutions to answer big problems, whether it comes to climate change, whether it comes to solving the housing crisis, et cetera, et cetera. There's many of these issues. And so there is room in whatever you do. You don't necessarily have to be a specialized researcher, but there is room in whatever you do to try to find a better solution for how things can come about.
In our careers conversation, when we're talking to Zach, one of the things that really came up is what was really valuable to him about starting as an architect, but then becoming a startup founder, is his ability to be a generalist. And I think for practicing architects, being that generalist, being able to do many things at the same time is really a valuable skill. But what that takes away from is your ability to really focus on a specific thing and really discover new things about that particular niche. And I think what's emerging is that with research, it's really kind of the opposite, is instead of becoming a generalist doing all of these things, you are focusing on something like materials or sustainability or blockchain consensus mechanisms in order to bring that thing back into the design language so that all these other generalists who are building things in the real world can use your knowledge to make their projects better.
Yeah, it's inverted in a sense. Like you're specializing in one thing, but that one thing has widespread applicability so that it will be generally applied versus generally applying a series of specific things to one specific kind of building or project. And yeah, that's maybe you addressed an interesting dialectic, Libo, in terms of the researcher versus the specific practitioner, where one is focused on the problem at hand, the immediate problem in front of them, versus the other is the researchers maybe focused on the problem that surrounds them, that is kind of all over and all encompassing, but dealing with that in a very specific manner.
What is something that you think the listener should most look forward to in this next season? And what's something that you're looking forward to listening to again?
For me, I think it's quite simply the fact that you can engage with the built environment in so many different ways. And I'm not personally looking for a career change, but it is inspiring to see how people who have a fascination with space can then start to find their own niche and really probably dive really deep into something, but then, as we were just saying, reemerge and then apply it to the rest of the world, and hopefully create some sort of networking effect where people learn from each other, and those discoveries, those breakthroughs can have a rippling effect throughout the industry and throughout the world and really change things for the better.
Yeah, the diversity was amazing. And also, I think that diversity comes from knowing who you are, right? I think research is also a way to understand what you want to specialize in. So the guests brings a whole spectrum from sustainability, from data science, even more applied data science and machine learning, and still in architecture and visioning side, policy, like cross-disciplinary research with econometrics and design. Like it's a whole variety, a variety pack. So I'm sure there are more. Like this is just a very small sample of what research is happening out there. So I think it is more of an encouraging season, and encouraging to me to be excited about the potential possibilities that we haven't found, like the things that we can learn more about the built environment.
Yeah, what's out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really gets me going when I listen to people who are really passionate about what they do. And I think this is probably a cohort of people who really bring that excitement out when they talk about the things that they're researching. And I don't know if it's that they don't get to talk about it much or people don't ask them about it much, but I'm looking forward to getting re-excited for each episode that I listen to share that excitement with each of our guests on these really important things that they're working on.